So I'll take a deep breath, acknowledge that wherever we are on Turtle Island, we are on indigenous land. We're very grateful to the Ohlone people here in Santa Cruz. We're all indigenous to somewhere. We call on our indigenous ancestors. We call on our guides of the light. We know this is in the most broad way, in the most non-religious way, this is a spiritual path that we're on. And to realize what Greta called for, to do what is absolutely necessary, not just what is politically feasible, because without that, her generation has no hope. So those are our marching orders, and we welcome you all today. We're again here with Danny Sheehan, who is co-founder with Sarah Nelson, his partner and wife, of Romero Institute and of the earlier Christic Institute, constitutional attorney par excellence, all-around great storyteller, wonderful guy. Danny Sheehan, take it away, Danny.
All right, we're back to life. All right, but thank you everybody for I would say coming out for a Friday evening, but thank you for staying in for a Friday evening for us to get together on this. What we're attempting to do is to try to rise up above the kind of din of everyday horrors that are basically put out anew each day by Trump. You know, I mean, as of yesterday, we know that he's suggesting that maybe we're going to have to delay the election. He's, talking about the fact that, if there are any mail-in ballots, it's going to take weeks and weeks to determine who the president is. And then he added that with all the litigation that will follow, it could take years to really figure out who the new president is and what the election says. So that, these types of bizarre actions that he takes, in addition to sending in, federalized law enforcement people into Portland and other places. I've been a little busy this week because the police department in Seattle, Washington, has subpoenaed the outtakes of all of the video coverage by the 4 major television stations there in Seattle and the Seattle Times, demanding that they have to respond to a subpoena to produce all of their outtakes from their videos. They want to be able to see all the people that were in the demonstrations and who did what at any given time. The media have been fighting that, and so I've been getting calls because, as you probably know, that we initiated at the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review back in 1968, the original case challenging the subpoenaing of outtakes from NBC television during the civil disturbances that arose after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's the case that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court and generated the Shield statutes that were put in and actually caused the swing vote, Justice Powell, in the United States Supreme Court decision that came out under Brandsburg versus Hayes, to say that, well, it wasn't really necessary to determine whether there was an absolute First Amendment right of journalists to protect their news sources, but said that in light of all the Shield statutes that have been passed, they didn't have to pass on that issue right yet. But now with the new court in place, the 5-judge kind of reactionary majority that's in the Supreme Court, we have to do a lot of considering about what steps we're going to take here to deal with those subpoenas that have come out. So I got tied up on that one during the week, and that despite my best efforts not to get drug into the day-to-day machinations of this administration so that we could stay focused on the kind of things we're talking about here on our Friday evenings together, I myself understand how you get dragged into these things. So what we want to do is back up out of those things and come together here at the end of each week to kind of analyze our ongoing process, which in my opinion is what we have to really do is a couple things. Number one, we have to keep an eye on this huge existential threat that's being posed to us by global climate change, and to try to stay focused on that issue as it relates to the upcoming selection of the president, the vice president, the new cabinet members, the Senate races that are coming up. How do we assist in keeping forward leaning on this issue of global climate change and in the context of the larger progressive agenda that we have to have for the people? So what I wanted to do is I want to point out what I think is getting ready to happen. There's an awful lot of talk, as I said, in the news this week about trying to figure out what's going on if, in fact, Donald Trump loses the election but refuses to leave office. I've sent an email to Larry Tribe, my professor, constitutional law professor at Harvard. He's working with a team of people at Harvard Law School right now to determine what all the legal steps are that are available to us to take the steps necessary to get Trump out of office, assuming he loses the election. And that's, of course, not just the popular vote, but we're talking about the Electoral College. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now tonight, because I think that it's clear, as I've said before, that the high probabilities are that not only is Joe Biden, not only is he going to win the election, but he's going to win the election by such a dramatic amount that, in fact, it's going to forestall any of these major litigations that the administration is figuring on doing, along with William Barr. So what I've said is, look, let's us here think in terms of the high-level probability projections that obviously Joe Biden, even though technically he's not the nominee of the Democratic Party yet, we all know that it's a 99.9% probability that he's going to be the nominee. This 1/10 of 1% being just if he were to get hit by a train or something between now and the virtual convention, he's going to be the nominee. I think that it's now growingly obvious, as I've been talking about for the last 3 years at least, that's almost certain that Kamala Harris is going to be the vice presidential selection, which means that we have to think in terms of, well, who other than Kamala Harris is going to be the attorney general to actually carry out the potential prosecutions of Trump and his cadre after they get out of office. And we have to try to also think about, in terms of, very importantly, who is going to be heading up the Environmental Protection Administration. These are critical places for the global climate change issues we have to deal with. Okay, so I want to move through some of these things to help set the stage for our discussion here. As I said, that it's clear that everybody feels comfortable about projecting a 99.9% probability that Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic Party nominee. Everybody feels, I think, fairly confident that it's going to be one of 3 different Black women who are going to be selected by Biden to be, and the Democratic National Committee, by the way, and the Democratic policy people. This is going to be a selection that's being made by the regular Democratic Party officials as to who the vice presidential candidate should be, because I think it's also probably likely that everybody here, the 95 of us so far, that we realize that it's probable that Joe Biden may well not run for a second term. He may come in for 1 full term to undertake to get things back to normal. And we'll have some discussion about what that means exactly. But that's what's likely to be going on here. So the DNC is going to be involved in making certain that whoever the vice presidential nominee is going to be, that it's not a person just arbitrarily picked by Joe Biden. It's going to be a person whom the Democratic National Committee and the other major decision makers within the party are going to decide who the candidate should be, the likely candidate for 2024. So I want to have our discussion here in that context tonight about what do we do, what do we 100 people or so do between now and the election to try to have as much influence as we can on who the cabinet members are going to be. and what policies they're going to be actually implementing, with some special focus on the issue of global climate change. So what we have to take a look at first is the fact that Joe Biden has put out a 20-page statement. This is the statement here that he has on his global climate change policies. He has adopted the terminology of the Green New Deal in his thing, saying that Biden believes that the Green New Deal is a crucial framework for meeting the climate challenges that we face. So he's been pressed into a position of being willing to use the term the Green New Deal. A number of people that are involved in political circles are suggesting we avoid using that particular term because it's going to cause everybody on the extreme right wing to what? Not vote for Joe Biden. I don't think that's likely to happen. But that's the quest for the independents. This constant dialogue goes on about the need to try to bring in as many independent voters as possible to vote for Joe Biden, and that some not insignificant percentage of these people might be put off by the use of the term the Green New Deal because they are all going to associate it with the AOC. But the bottom line is Joe has stepped forward, and in this statement he's issued, this 20-page document, he's actually utilized the term the Green New Deal. But you'll notice that how he phrases it is this: the Green New Deal is a crucial framework for attempting to meet the challenges of global climate change. He isn't, as such, endorsing the bill that was introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey into the Congress. He's suggesting that it's a logical framework for being able to deal with this. And what you'll notice with Biden, and none of this is to suggest in the slightest that anybody should not work as hard as she or he can to make sure Biden wins by the largest majority possible, so as to try to forestall at least some of the more obvious efforts that might be taken by Trump with the assistance of William Barr in the Justice Department to keep him in power. I want everybody to stay as enthusiastic as possible about participating in getting him elected. But it's important to keep in mind that he has called for, and you can see it in the document, he has called for moving to a 100% clean energy economy, which he calls a net zero emissions economy by 2050. Now that's a very specific position that he has taken here. This document that Joe Biden's campaign put out is very specific about the fact that they're talking about a net zero emissions economy by 2050. Now that means two things. What that means is that they're not talking about stopping the emissions of global greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What they're talking about is setting up a system that offsets the continued emission of global greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere by drawdown systems and reduction of additional amounts going in. So this net zero standard that they're using is an important one to understand. It's not as radical as attempting to get to an actual 100% clean energy system. Though you'll see that even in his document, he uses the terms sort of interchangeably. Is a 100% clean energy system or a net zero system. They aren't the same thing. But the most important factor to keep in mind here is that he is proposing not getting to net zero until 2050. Now, whereas you'll notice in the 50-page summary that we sent out of the Romero Institute's proposed California Green New Deal, we're proposing to get to net zero by 2035. And we're also proposing getting to 80% of net zero by 20 2038 or 2030 rather. So that we're talking about a very accelerated program here of trying to get to 80% net zero by 2028. That is at the end of the next 2 terms that are going to be coming up. So that I want us to keep this in mind, that I'm looking at the next 2 terms of a Democratic Party administration getting our country to net zero. Okay, not putting it off or getting to 80% of net zero by the end of this next 2 terms. So that's very different than setting targets of not getting to net zero until 2050. So all of this devolves into a policy of having to try to figure out what we need to do to try to put maximum pressure on the incoming Democratic Party administration to accelerate the process that Joe Biden is otherwise talking about here in the context of his campaign to be president. So that's the overall tactic that we need to keep in mind here. Now, if you look further into this, the 20-page document that Joe has put out on this, what you'll notice if you go through the entire document, as I have, with a red pen and a green pen, and you underline everything in green that is really good stuff that he is saying, and you go through the document with a red pen and you underline in red some of the trouble that is in this document. And what you discover is that they come out almost perfectly balanced. You get almost a tit for tat throughout the document of good things being said and troublesome things being said. Now, this is reflective of the Democratic DNC present position, because you remember that the Democratic Leadership Conference that got created right at the end of the Cold War, right at the point where President Gorbachev signed the release of all of the republics, the socialist republics in Russia, in the Soviet Union. What happened is that the Republican Party virtually immediately retrenched back to the hard right that it really represented during the robber baron era that went on from the end of the American Civil War around 1868 all the way to 1898, that 30-year period that generated the robber baron era and ended up resulting in the late 1890s into the age of American imperialism, which was characterized as gunboat diplomacy, manifest destiny, white man's burden, this entire age of American imperialism. And so that what we're saying is that when we got to the end of the Cold War, that began right at the end of World War I, actually, with the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in October of 1917, the entire period, all the way up until the end of 1991, that basically 75-year period, was characterized by what came to be known as the Cold War. There's a lot of misrepresentation of that not having really come about until after the end of World War II. But the fact of the matter is, when you look into it historically, you see that the United States ruling circles were engaged right from the very beginning in trying to crush the socialist revolution in Russia. None of this is to at least pretend even for a moment that process in the Soviet Union didn't degenerate fairly quickly into this kind of aggressive authoritarian deprivation of individual human rights in the Soviet Union under Stalin and others. But the fact of the matter is that the original reaction that was had on the part of the leadership of the entire robber baron era to the onset of the socialist revolution in Russia was one of terror, in that they ended up establishing a very aggressive program of attempting to push out the influence of the United States through military means to secure access, actually privileged access, to the strategic raw materials around the world that were deemed to be necessary for the further development of the major corporations in the Industrial Revolution in the United States. This is simply a matter of history It's not something that people talk about much on the political tours that they go on, but everybody knows this from an historical point of view. And so what I'm saying here is that when Gorbachev signed the agreement on December 31st of 1991 to release all of the socialist republics from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and basically step back from the Cold War, what happened was the Republicans here in the United States just immediately retrenched back to their hardcore right-wing position that they had developed after the Civil War throughout the robber baron era. So what happened was, unfortunately, the Democratic Party, the structural bureaucratic Democratic Party, under the leadership of Richard Gebhardt and others, came forward with the Democratic Leadership Conference or Council that actually started actively proposing that the Democratic Party start stepping back from a whole series of the New Deal proposals that were made under Roosevelt, and to step back from the kind of public welfare programs they had, a lot of these things. And so that we got the leadership of the Democratic Leadership Conference proposing a shift in the Democratic Party from being moderately to the left of center to being moderately to the right of center. And you got this entire new kind of generation of Democratic Party leadership, symbolized by Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Al Gore and Richard Gebhardt and the others, where they were proposing, in their own words, a new, more moderate Democratic Party. And some people would say it was in order to actually win elections. But what it really was is that since the right-wing Republican Party had moved so hardcore to the right, that the political pragmatists didn't see any real advantage in staying to the left of center, because they could move to the right of center and pick up some of the more independent votes. And what was anybody going to do in a strictly two-party system? What options did people have? And so this temptation on the part of the Democratic National Committee to go in the direction of the Democratic Leadership Council or Conference, and remember that Hillary Clinton ended up being the chairperson of the policy committee of the Democratic Leadership Conference. And so that all the policies that she was promulgating, that ended up being much more moderate than the New Deal policies of Franklin Roosevelt, for example. And even in the Kennedy administration and in the Johnson administration, they started having much more moderate sets of policies. And so what the challenge is here is that Obama came into that democratic world. And Obama, also had this kind of pragmatic, a more moderate type of position. Even though his language was very liberal, his positions were actually quite moderate, as we saw. Now, I raise all of that because this is the environment that Joe Biden ended up being brought up in, not so much as when he was chair of the House Judiciary Committee, or when he's even the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, but even when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was actually, his tendencies are more liberal than the Democratic Leadership Conference. And as I mentioned to you before, I know Joe Biden comparatively well. I briefed him when I was chief counsel for the Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C. I briefed him when he was the head of the Judiciary Committee. When Larry Tribe, my constitutional law professor, would come down to testify in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, for example, to oppose the constitutional amendment for the flag burning thing. There were a whole series of those things. And I also met with Joe Biden when he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, when I was legal counsel for the Iran-Contra case, investigating all the drug smuggling and the massive assassination programs and stuff going on in Central America. So I've had dinner with him, as I've mentioned. I know his son, Hunter. Hunter was in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps when I was general counsel for the Jesuits. Hunter met his wife in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. So I've had dinner with all of them. So I like Joe. I think Joe is very intelligent. He has a great heart. people all pretty much like him. There is this myth that goes around about him being kind of a bit of a bumbler, or putting his foot in his mouth. That's part of the national news media characterizing of him. He's really fairly competent and intelligent and very liberal by his disposition. But he became vice president in the later context of this kind of more moderate position on the part of the Democratic Party. So what Joe finds himself right now in this strange position of being, caught up as vice president in this new, more moderate Democratic Party of the Clintons and even Obama. But he sees himself confronted by an ever increasing demographic inside the Democratic Party of younger people, much more women activists in this, Black women activists very specifically. And so he finds himself in this position now of realizing that in order to be an effective candidate for the Democratic Party, he has to go back now from the more moderate positions of the Democratic Party toward a more liberal set of policies. And he hasn't quite gotten to the point of thinking in terms of being a progressive, but he now feels more comfortable returning to his sort of liberal roots. And so you'll see this thing in the bill, in the proposal that he set forth, this 20-page document that I'm talking about. You go through the thing and you see things like, for example, he will say that for example, I'll give this, to ensure that the US achieves 100% clean energy economy by reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Okay, now that's a classic kind of liberal position. On the one hand, pretending it's 100% clean energy economy, but it's not. It's a net zero emissions system by 2050 is not a 100% clean energy system. And then he goes on to say, he says, and he will demand that Congress enacts legislation in the first year of his presidency that, one, establishes an enforcement mechanism that includes setting milestone targets by the end of his first term in 2025 for getting to net zero by 2050. Now, when you read something like that, you see that he's talking about going all the way to his end of his 4-year term before he's even going to potentially establish milestone targets that will get us to net zero by 2050. Now, this is not to condemn him for this kind of squirrely language that tends to characterize a lot of liberal policy positions. But the reality is that this goes on throughout his entire paper. That he says, for example, he's going to try to rally the rest of the world to step up to the threat of global climate change, it says in his document. And what he says is that Joe knows how to stand up with America's allies, to stand up to our adversaries, and to level with any world leader about what has to be done. He will not only commit the United States to the Paris Agreement on climate change, he will go much further than that. He will lead an effort to get every major country to ramp up their ambition to set climate targets. So what this means, when you really take a look at it from a lawyer's point of view, if you were trying to make a contract with somebody and that's all they were really willing to do, you'd say, wait a second, we got to dig a little harder to get a contract that really means something here. To be putting pressure on people to increase their or accelerate their targets, it is a very different thing from doing what is necessary to prevent the catastrophe that global climate change is really threatening right now. And this goes on throughout his document. And that I've gone through the entire document. I would suggest to you as homework, now that we've reached our 100 persons coming in now, the group of 100, I would suggest that you take a look at this document that I sent out to you, and you go through this thing with a green pen and a red pen, and you will discover what I have discovered is that there's this almost complete balance between him saying things that are good for him to say in their liberal positions, but that they are equally balanced out by all of these different words, like he says he's going to commit every federal structure to reduce climate pollution and require any federal permitting decisions to give consideration to the effects of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. You know, good. It's great that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, when they're considering a potential pipeline, will give consideration to global greenhouse gas emissions. But what does that mean? I mean, you know, I've dealt with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I've been across the table from them. You know, I mean, they can give it all the consideration they want. I sat in the meeting on the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example, when they had a meeting of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This is under the Obama administration. And they had only one person from the Standing Rock Tribal Council in the room at the time. And the rest of it, he was completely surrounded by 20 of the employees of the energy transfer partners who were going to go in there and browbeat him into going along with them building this pipeline. And that's what they call, they're giving consideration to the issues of global climate change. So I raise that by way of both praising Joe Biden for everything you can underline in green in his document, but having to undertake a realistic critique of what it is he's really promising here, which reminds me of the time, I've told somebody about this, when I was out in Iowa back in 2008, when Obama won the nomination. And I was working at that time in one of the other campaigns, and with John Edwards. This was before we all discovered about what was going on with John Edwards. But that I was working with John Edwards in his campaign out in Iowa in the primary, and I was assigned responsibility to go and meet with Obama about his position on nuclear power, right? And so we were just outside of Fairfield, and he was getting set to come on stage at the Fairfield High School, and he and I had this meeting scheduled. So we sat there just off stage, and I said, "Hello, I'm Dan Sheehan." He said, "Oh yes." He says, "I know John has had you come over to try to talk me out of supporting private nuclear power. Is that right?" And I said, "That's right." He said, "Well, look, I know that you did the Silkwood case out in Oklahoma, and you did the 3 Mile Island litigation there in Pennsylvania. And so I'm assuming you're just going to try to tell me that I can't support nuclear power at all." And I said, "That's right." And he said, "Well, look, Dan, let me say this." He said, "Look, I know that there are difficulties with the waste disposal and actually the safety of these facilities at the present time. But I'll tell you what," he said. And he looked all around to make sure nobody was listening. And he leaned over and he put his hand on my arm and he said, "Look, I will give you my own personal guarantee that I will not authorize the building of any single nuclear power plant until I am personally convinced, A, that it can be run safely, and B, that they can safely dispose of the waste materials." And then he got up and started to walk away. And I said, "Excuse me." I said, "Excuse me, hold it." I said, "The fact of the matter is that neither one of those things is going to take place during an administration of just 4 years." And he turned and looked at me and he said, "Well, good. Then neither you nor I have to worry about anything. Isn't that right?" And so then he got up and started to walk away again. I said, "Well, excuse me." I said, "You know, that was very good." But I said, "But how much money do you plan to squander out of the alternative energy budget on financing the oil companies that own most of these nuclear power plants, you know, to try to develop a safe nuclear reactor or a way to dispose of the thing? He said, how much do you plan to squander on that from the alternative energy budget?" And he looked at me and said, "How much do you have in mind?" And I said, "Nothing." I said, I don't think you should be spending any money wasted on that." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, when you get a number, call me." You see, now that's classic Obama, right? But the fact is, it's classic liberal. It's actually classic neoliberal. And so that what we're going to witness is we're going to see a transition from Joe Biden moving from his neoliberal vice presidential position into his traditional liberal position. And you see it reflected here in this document. you see him talking about the fact that he's going to go much further than the Obama-Biden administration. And that's what he's saying. And so he's going to go a little bit farther because he knows that there's this progressive threat on his left. And he knows that. He knows that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were basically breathing down his neck. And until Jim Clyburn, came out and endorsed him in South Carolina, he was definitely on the ropes. I think we all know that. I mean, everybody's going, oh, and you got all the old stories of Joe Biden, how he was mumbling and didn't know where he was, and all these bad jokes about him being too old and everything. But then when Clyburn came out and endorsed him, everybody went, oh, well, okay, here's the Congressional Black Caucus. Here's all the black organizers in the southern states that we've got to have. So good, he's going to be the nominee. And so now Joe is knowing he's going to have to say things that are more liberal.
Hey, Danny, can you take us, with time you've got left, to the California Green New Deal, what we're going to pragmatically do to move him and get us into a real strong progressive position? Thanks.
Well, here's the thing, is that what we put in you also got the 50-page summary, executive summary of our global our greenhouse, our California Green New Deal, and what it calls for is an 80% reduction in the actual global greenhouse gas emissions by 2028, actually, okay? And that we're going to achieve full net negative carbon sequestration by 2030. And so this is a lot different than what's being said by Joe Biden and the Democratic National Committee right now. And the fact of the matter is, what we're going to be doing in this particular bill, and you've got the whole outline in front of you now, and it shows step by step, detail by detail, how it is that we're talking about going about doing that. We're talking about setting up entire departments here in the state of California, using as many of the existent ones as we can, but setting up some new ones in which we're going to be setting forth all kinds of, for example, declaring an actual emergency status of global climate change, similar to what Governor Newsom did recently with regard to the homelessness in California. He pushed straight through the exception that you're not allowed to have an omnibus bill, in the state legislature. He got a rule passed to have an exception to that, to have a big omnibus bill for dealing with homelessness. We need to have him do that with regard to global climate change. We need to have an emergency declared. We want to establish an office of climate action in the government. We've got numerous things. We have to expand the California green bond market by $100 billion by 2025 to $500 billion by 2030. These are concrete ways in which we'll fund the actual activities that need to be undertaken, which include a green corps for training new workers, people that are displaced from the fossil fuel industry and the fracking, that they have to get retrained. We're talking about setting up into the Department of Education additional funding to go to the community colleges to actually have specific courses for training people that have been displaced from their jobs in the fossil fuel industry. We've got, and that call, it comes under the Department of Education for increasing these activities in the community colleges. We have got the vehicles. We've got specific provisions in here for limiting the production and sale of fossil fuel engined cars in the state of California. That we're talking about having to require a decrease of 10% or an increase of 10% of the mileage for cars operating in the state of California by 2030. We're talking about actually prohibiting the sale of fossil fuel cars in the state of California by 2035. We're talking about giving subsidies to families to be able to purchase electric vehicles. We're talking about subsidies going to the companies producing electrical vehicles. We're talking specifically about setting up electrical charging stations funded by the state of California so that people have free access to electrical power for their vehicles. These are extremely concrete details that we're talking about here. But the bottom line is, it's important to remember that what we're doing is we're saying that that the standards that are governing the California Green New Deal is not what it is that we think is immediately politically feasible with the elected representatives who are all in place at the present time. What we're saying is the two principles that govern this statute is, what is it that's technologically possible to do, okay? And what absolutely has to get done. I mean, we know that we have to do what it is that's absolutely necessary to do, because we're talking about catastrophic consequences here. And yet the political officials are talking about, well, let's get adjusted to certain kind of negative impacts from global climate change. There's nothing we're going to be able to do from what's already been put up in the atmosphere. And we're not going to be able to do anything about what we're going to put up in the atmosphere between now and 2050. So there are going to be really negative consequences. So let's get adaptation for those things. And we're saying, wait a second, you're affirmatively allowing the continued emission of global greenhouse gas emissions up into the atmosphere, which are going to cost thousands and thousands of lives in the future. And yet because you're so insistent upon being able to maintain your position in office, and to be viewed by your colleagues in the legislature as a reasonable person who's going to go along with reasonable things. And we all know that we have to depend upon certain contributions from the oil and gas corporations, to maintain our campaigns, that they're making these compromises all the time. And so what I'm saying here to you is that the bill that we have sent to you, the outline, the 50-page outline that gives you all the details of what it is we're talking about, we have a 235-page draft of the actual bill with full details of how you would go about doing that, what committee is going to get put into, et cetera. And we're going to be having a bill that's probably 250 pages long by the time that we get done, or 350 pages rather. Okay. I take it we've got 350 pages already. It's probably going to be 500 pages to give you all the details of this. Now, the thing that I want to point out here is that this is extremely important, is that the person who is selected by the Democratic National Committee here next week, who she's going to be named next week, I think it's like a 95% probability it's going to be Kamala Harris, as I've indicated. We've known that for the last 3 years, that that's likely to happen, unless she stepped on a grenade somewhere, and she's conducted herself adequately now, and we know that she's the likely candidate. And so that what you do is you look at her position on global climate change, and there she has refused to join. When she was Attorney General, she refused to join in the litigation against the major ExxonMobil corporations for their infliction of global climate damage on the state of California. She thought that was a little too forward-leaning. She, in fact, has taken contributions in the past from the oil and gas industry. She has expressed doubts about fracking, but she has not agreed to vote for a ban on fracking in the state of California. She's also extremely vague about her position on nuclear power. And the thing that is important to point out about Joe's position, Joe has specifically called for the financing of nuclear power. Now that's an extraordinarily important position that he's taking. He's going to try to lead the Democratic Party during his 4-year administration into financing private nuclear power plants. That's just not acceptable. All right. And as I say, Kamala Harris is still very iffy about whether she's going to support nuclear power or not. And she also was criticized by the Sunrise Movement, the young people, for her at first not agreeing to attend CNN's climate crisis town hall because she was going around California doing fundraising events. And so that they had to criticize her to get her to come to the CNN thing. And she was the last of all the major candidates for the presidency when she was running for the presidency to actually formulate a global greenhouse gas emissions policy. And she didn't do anything very original. She just adopted portions of Governor Jay Inslee's bill and Elizabeth Warren's bill and some of Cory Booker's bill. And so she hasn't ever listed it as one of the primary things that she has to be working on until she thought she had to. So all I'm saying is that this doesn't differentiate her from a lot of other politicians who don't do anything that has risk to it, political risk, until they see it as being an advantage to them. But what I'm suggesting is that a Biden, Kamala Harris ticket going into this election is not going to be advocating the kind of things that really need to be done and are even technologically feasible. They're going to be doing something that they view to be actually more politically feasible in the short run, okay? And so that what we need to do, we need to address the issue of, okay, so what do we do about this? How do we, what concrete steps do we take to try to impose a kind of a pressure on them to do more progressive things? My proposal is this. I have done the research on this, and I have discovered that AOC was actually born on October 13th of 1989. And I want you to think about that for a minute, because what that means is she will be 35 years old 3 weeks before the 2024 election. Okay, which means that she will be legally able to run for the presidency in 2024. Now, what that means is that her influence among young people, her influence among progressive people, her influence inside the party to be coming forward with a set of proposals that are much more forward-leaning, that are much more capable of addressing what needs to be done to address global climate change, among other things. It has to be tied to the potential that she is going to be pushed as a candidate by the progressive community to be the primary challenger to Kamala Harris in 2024. I mean, these are the kind of plans that you have to deal with. When I was in Washington, D.C. as general counsel for the Jesuit Order, I remember talking to somebody in 1992 who was talking about offering the Democratic vice presidential nomination to John Kerry, along when Al Gore ran for the presidency in 2000. The Democratic leadership was engaged in those kind of conversations in order to talk John Kerry into stepping back on the Iran-Contra investigation, because they had cut a deal with the leadership of the Republican Party to allow the Central Intelligence Agency to go into Nicaragua and secretly fund the campaign for Chamorro. And actually, they sent in Roger Ailes to be the campaign chairperson for him. And so that those kind of conversations are going on inside the Democratic National Committee. That's why they're trying to figure out to make sure that Kamala Harris, if she's going to be the nominee for the vice president, is going to be their candidate for 2024. Because it's highly probable that Joe Biden may not run for a second term. And so that therefore there's going to be a primary contest inside the Democratic Party in 2024 for who the presidential nominee is going to be, with the DNC leaning forward to have it be Kamala Harris, the progressive community lifting up AOC as being potentially the presidential candidate for a truly progressive agenda, representing much younger people, much more forward-leaning people who are willing to do what's necessary to establish the protection against global climate change. Now, what I'm saying here is that the Democratic Party has the historical record of reaching out to their left and absorbing policies that they view to be potentially more popular with the general population of the Democratic voting public than the ones that they would like to advocate because of the people who actually fund their campaigns, which are major corporations and major wealthy people, and they have a much more conservative interest. And so that what they do is they reach out when they feel they have to do this, and they will absorb policies that are being proposed by more progressive elements. Now, that may well happen during the course of this 4-year first term. And so but what you have to have is you have to have a reasonable, not just a threat, but you have to have a reasonable, viable option of an alternative candidate who is going to be able to assemble a full cabinet, to know who the cabinet members are going to be, to know what their policies are going to be able to put these forward, and to start basically representing almost a government in waiting, which if Joe Biden and the Democratic National Committee were as smart as I think they should be doing right now. They should be setting forth who their Secretary of State is going to be. They should be setting forth who the head of their EPA is going to be. They should be setting forth who their Secretary of the Treasury is going to be. Joe Biden should be campaigning with an entire government in waiting to take the place of Donald Trump, so that it's not everybody sitting around, waiting to see what Joe Biden is going to do, who he's going to pick, after he gets elected, in that 90-day period from November 3rd all the way through to January 20th, that we've got to do something that's different than usual. We've got to mount a campaign that is going to be able to blow out Donald Trump, to the point where he doesn't think it's even conceivably feasible for him to challenge the outcome of the election. We've got to be able to establish a winning record in so many of the key states that even William Barr can't go in and challenge and have an investigation with the Justice Department of alleged invalid, mail-in ballots. We've got to do something like that. Now, the fact of the matter is that it's very unlikely that Joe Biden or the Democratic National Committee are going to have the kind of creative insight to do this. They're not going to be listing who their Secretary of State is going to be. They're not going to be listing who the head of the EPA is going to be. They're going to be running on a pseudo personality cult, of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That is not smart. That is not smart. And not only that, it's not even in the public interest to do something like that. So what we should be doing is we should be trying to figure out who the people are that should be in the cabinet, so that it's not just the DNC or other people sitting around, political professionals trying to decide who they think the candidates ought to be, and keep them secret until after Joe Biden is elected. This is a different way of approaching the citizens participating in government. As I said last week, our political activities in our country can no longer be viewed as a spectator sport on our part, because we've seen what they'll do. We've seen what the professional politicians will do, and it is totally inadequate. And we have a situation here with the global climate change where it's not just a matter of being displeased with their inadequate performance. It's a matter of it being a catastrophe, for our people on our planet. And so that what we've got to do, there's a moral obligation for us to come forward with concrete political options and alternatives, so that they can determine what we're really talking about here. So, so we should start putting the pressure on right now on the Democratic National Committee, on Joe Biden and Kamala Harris after she gets named next week here, to come forward and start naming their cabinet, so that the cabinet can be out campaigning all across the country and directing the head of particular departments that are particularly important inside certain key states, go into that state and say what it is she or he is going to be proposing for policies that are particularly pertinent to the people in that state, rather than having to wait for Joe Biden to come into the state, or wear himself out traveling to all 50 states, or sending Kamala Harris in as his proxy. There are 33 positions that we talked about just last week. This is that This is that list of them that I showed you last week. Here they are.
Danny,
yeah.
we've had requests from 3 or 4 people that you share that. So we should get those 33 positions out to everyone.
Okay, we can do that. So, but here they are. You know, I mean, like who is going to be the Secretary of State, right? Now, the problem is the Democratic National Committee, with their lack of creative thinking, you know, they aren't even thinking about the obvious person to be Secretary of State. Who's the obvious person to be Secretary of State for Joe Biden? Who is it? It's Barack Obama. What are we fucking dumb here? We don't know that he would be the best Secretary of State. He knows all the major foreign leaders. Everybody trusts him. He's a totally beloved guy. He's totally competent. He can go forward and represent the United States government to try to reestablish some level of reasonable credibility of us in the international playing field, you know? But no, you don't do that. Why is that? Well, because it's not done. That's not how you do it. You know, a person who has been president of the United States can't go around and be just Secretary of State, even though it did happen once in the past, you know, with John Adams. But the bottom line, it can be done. But they're not thinking like that. They're not thinking like that. And what I'm saying is that what we've got to do as citizens, we've got to move forward and take charge of what it is that we all believe needs to happen and needs to get done, so that the people in the Democratic National Committee and other people can see at least that there are concrete proposals being made to them as to what they can do to be more creative. I discovered this when I was the legal counsel for the Jesuits. I was surprised that they hadn't thought of all kinds of really important things that they could be doing, but they weren't doing it. But when I happened to be there, I said, look, I can think of several really important things that you could do. And as soon as you make it clear to them what they are and how practical it is to do these things, they go, oh, gee, yeah, you know, that's a good idea. So what I'm saying is, it isn't that they're in bad faith. These people are not in bad faith. They're just not as creative as they need to be. And our job as citizens in a democracy is to be able to put forth concrete proposals to them and show them in practical terms why this will work. That's what the California Green New Deal is all about, is showing them what concretely can be done in a state. Now, we have the advantage, of course, of having a supermajority in both the Assembly and in the Senate, the state Senate, and a fairly progressive governor, but that's fine. Everybody knows that California, what we're like. As I've said a number of times before, we have to be able to convince everybody that we, citizens of California, are just like the rest of America, only sooner. That's the key to this thing, you know, that we can do it sooner than other people, but we can show them that it works. We can show them the concrete details of how this thing will work, how it'll be financed, how you can work in the congressional or inside the state assembly districts and actually generate support for these things.
I know we all want it to happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Danny. Open it up so everybody can talk and give your thanks.
All right. Let's unmute.
Bye.
Help with you, girls.
Thanks.
All right.
Good for hanging in there.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, Daddy.
I'll see you on Friday, but
Bye, everybody.
I'll be sending